Welcome. I would like to welcome everyone to the Phillips Barry Lecture on behalf of the Music and Song section and my co-convener, Marge Steiner. My name is Steve Winnick, and I'm the other co-convener of the Music and Song section. And the way we decide on the Phillips Barry Lecture who's going to be asked to speak is we throw it open to our business meeting every year, whom to ask for the following year. And last year, several names were thrown out, but the one that came to the fore was Bruce's name, on the principle that Bruce Jackson is in Buffalo and hasn't been to an AFS meeting in many years. And I guess there's something of a story to why you haven't been. Well, because, so, yeah, well, that doesn't sound very impressive, does it? The real reason, of course, is that Bruce Jackson is an expert in many areas and someone who's a distinguished folklorist and has worked in the area of fieldwork, that is theorizing and talking about fieldwork and writing about fieldwork, photography, film, and music, and of course music is what our section does. And we were aware of many of Bruce's projects, and he's been telling me about some of the others, including his film course and his film festival here in Buffalo. So he is a distinguished professor here at SUNY Buffalo and has been working as a folklorist all these years. And we thought, wouldn't it be great to get Bruce Jackson to come to AFS again? And so we thought about how to entice him to come. And I sent him an email which went astray. I think you never got it. I think it went to the wrong address. I made a blunder, but I knew he was coming to the Library of Congress, which is where I work, so I ambushed him, and I told him how important it would be to us if he would come to AFS and give the Phillips Barry Lecture. And he thought about it for a while, and he said, yeah, I've got this project that I can talk about. And he showed me some of the materials that you'll see tonight, and we just think what a great project this is. So I'm not going to speak for any longer. I'm just going to allow Bruce to tell you what it's all about, and then we will take questions at the end, just to let you know that this is being videotaped, and because of that, when you ask a question, we want the question to be on mic as well. So I will have a handheld wireless mic, and I'll be running around the room to give it to you at that time. So when you ask questions, just keep that in mind. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Professor Bruce Jackson.
Well, thank you all for coming. I'm here tonight because of a play, the Wooster Group, which is New York's most celebrated experimental theater company, did last year, based on some field work I did in 1964 in Texas prisons. Several other American folklorists, some of whom are at this meeting this week, also played an important role in that project, and I'll mention them later. This is the album, Negro Folklore from Texas State Prisons. It was released by Elektra in 1965. That date is important, and I will come back to it later. The title of the play is Negro Folklore from Texas State Prisons, a record album interpretation. The album has a structure. It's not just a group of songs, but I don't think anyone back then recognized it or noticed it. About 5 years ago, a young actor in New York, whose name is Eric Berryman, did notice it. And it is because of that that this whole project came about. Wooster began rehearsing this play on January 27th, 2016, continued off and on until October of that year. There were 8 work-in-progress performances in November 2016, all of which Diane Christian and I attended. That's Diane Christian right there. We've been married for a very long time. We've done several books and several documentary films together, and we've taught a film class together for the past 18 years. And so we do most things together. There was a full month of performances in New York at their theater, the Performing Garage, in October and November 2017. In 2018, the play went to Taiwan and to Korea and to Buffalo. It will be in St. Anne's Garage in Brooklyn for a month in March. Then it's probably going to Tokyo and Los Angeles not long after that. In a few minutes, I'll show you some photographs from some of the southern prison farms to give you a sense of the world in which the 1964 recordings were made. And so all of this won't be abstract. I'll also show you later a 20-minute video, the first 20 minutes of the play. And in that, Eric will tell you how the whole thing came to pass, how the play came to happen. It's a simple video. The camera's in one position in the theater, which is the way you watch a play. And you go to a play, you sit in one seat. But the thing is, when you watch a play in a theater, your eyes focus on one thing or another. You pay attention to one part of the stage or another. In this, the camera just points. What's different is a theatrical DVD, and one of those is now in production. At one of the work-in-progress performances I told you about, a man said to Elizabeth Lecomte, who is the guiding genius of Wooster, "This play ought to be seen in schools, in prisons, it ought to be available in libraries, there should be a DVD of it." And she said, "Yes, that would be wonderful. Do you have any idea how much a DVD of something like this would cost?" And he said, "How much would it cost?" Well, Wooster has done DVDs of a number of their productions, so she had a rough idea, so she doubled it. And she told him, and he said, "Okay." And Liz said, "Okay." He said, "Yes, you'll get a check from my foundation," which is what happened. They filmed 2 of the New York performances. They filmed 2 of the Buffalo performances. And they also filmed talkbacks in Buffalo and New York. Talkbacks are where the 3 actors in the play, in the New York, Kate Volk, the director, and I have a conversation with the audience. In Buffalo, Kate did not take part, and it was just the actors and me. I. She's an English teacher. The editing of that theatrical version was literally finished this morning, and we're now starting work on preparing the auxiliary materials that'll go on the DVD and an interactive website. About the angel who funded all of this, I can only say, sometimes miracles really do happen. For those of you who've sought grants, you know how much work it is, and this just descended, and we're quite happy. I want to tell you how and why this session came about. 4 years after I made that 1964 visit to Texas, and 3 years after the album came out, the Poor People's Campaign, Martin Luther King's last project, came to Washington. King had been murdered on April 4th of 1968. Streams of people converged on the Capitol and set up camp in an A-frame village near the reflecting pool, the other side of a stand of trees. My friend Ralph Rinsler, some of you in the room knew Ralph. Ralph created the festival on the Mall that still occurs in Washington every year. He eventually became deputy secretary of the Smithsonian. Ralph coordinated several musical events for the Poor People's Campaign on behalf of the Newport Folk Festival. Ralph got Bessie Jones and the Georgia Sea Island Singers, Reverend Frederick Douglass Kirkpatrick, Alan Lomax, Henry Glassy, and me involved in this. At that point, Alan, Kirk, and I were on the Newport Folk Festival board, and Ralph was our primary field worker. Ralph and Alan put on a Muddy Waters concert in the reflecting pool. There was a lot more, there was a lot of stuff going on. Last June was the 50th anniversary of the Poor People's Campaign. Several events in and around Washington marked it, many of them because of the efforts of Reverend William J. Barber II. One of the traveling exhibits showed some of my photographs of what we had been up to in Washington back in 1968. And there was a panel at the Library of Congress where I got to talk with some other people who had been there, which was quite nice. While I was sitting in the American Folklife Center, he came in and said, I need to talk with you later. I said, okay. So he came in, and we talked a while, and at first I said, I don't do folk music anymore. I don't have anything to do with it. I haven't for years. And then I remembered that I've been working on it nonstop for the last year and a half. So we thought that what we had been up to in 1964 and 1968, and the second Poor People's Campaign, and by the way, that campaign is still going on. Reverend Barber is still very, very much involved. And what the Wooster Group is doing might be of some interest here. And so that's what this is. Back when I was doing folklore research, I was documenting a world swiftly falling into the past. But what has happened recently has brought that world very much into the present, just as the events organized by Reverend Barber brought Martin Luther King's work very much into the present. Let me give you a little history first. I know some of the older heads in this room know what I'm going to say. Forgive me for saying things you know. The 1960s were a time when people of color were being turned away from ballot boxes. In the summer of 1964, 3 civil rights workers, Mickey Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman, were murdered in Mississippi. They went missing on June 21st. I was then on my way to Texas to do those recordings. I left Texas on July 12th. As I drove through Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, I heard radio reports about the search for the missing civil rights workers, who by then everybody assumed were dead. The bodies would not be found until August 4th. All 3 had been shot. The 2 white guys, they all had been beaten and shot. The 2 white guys had been shot in the heart. The black guy had been shot 3 times and castrated. Their murders and the violence done to participants in the Selma to Montgomery March the following year were important factors in the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which the United States Supreme Court recently vitiated. The past week in Georgia, a candidate for governor blocked voter registration of 52,000 voters, 2/3 of whom were people of color. Past week, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld a North Carolina ruling that anyone without a postal address could not register to vote, which disenfranchised most of the Native Americans living on reservations. I kept thinking, as I was writing that paragraph, of the lines from Bob Dylan's Stuck Inside a Mobile with the Memphis Blues again. And here I sit so patiently, waiting to find out what price you have to pay to get out of going through all these things twice. All of what I just told you is part of the reason the Wooster Group thought the material in the 1964 Texas prison record, some of which comes from slavery time, and much of which was recorded on prisons that had physically been slavery time plantations, had relevance now. And I want to show you some pictures of the southern plantation world I encountered. A few at the end are not of the prisons, and I will tell you what they are when I get to them. Hey, it worked. Okay. Now, I'm not going to say anything about these. I'm just going to run through them very quickly. What you're going to see are workers in Texas and some in Arkansas. When I worked in the Arkansas prisons a few years later, everybody running it had been in Texas. Arkansas was the first prison declared unconstitutional in the United States in a case called Holt versus Sarver 1. And they hired Texas wardens and Texas guards to come over and run their prison. So the two systems were almost identical. Some of the pictures. Oh yeah, could we dim the lights a little bit? Oh. Over there, maybe. This is one of my favorites. I just love that guy. I mean, he's like Mr. Tambourine Man. Water boy. Some of these guys are the guys who were on the record that the Wooster Group used. That's great. You won't have, yeah. Training the dogs. Picking cotton. The point of view, for those of you who notice the point of view, I'm on a horse in this, and this, and this, and this, and this. Prison is all about power and sitting on a horse with your arms akimbo while other people are bent over in a field articulates power. Hose squads. They built roads with hose, they did everything with hose. I look at this one, I just feel how hot it is. He's just playing with his pistol. Coming back into the building where the bodies are searched. In the penitentiary, your body is not your own. Anyone who's a free world person has the ability at any time to come over and touch any part of you. Okay, lights, please. Oh, wait, oh, no, not yet. The pictures I'm going to show you now are the primary people in the play. This is Kate Volk, who directed it. And Kate is a very famous actress in New York. New York referred to her as the Meryl Streep of Lower Manhattan. And this is Elizabeth Lecomte, who I mentioned before, who is the guiding genius of the company. This is in Liz's loft in New York when we were rehearsing one night. And this is Eric Berriman, the guy who made all this happen. This is Eric and Liz. This is Eric and Kate on the set. This is Philip Moore, one of the two other performers, and this is Jasper Magruder. Now the lights, please. I thought all of that prison stuff was long behind me, until November 9th, 2015, when I got an email from Eric. And this is what he wrote. Hello, Mr. Jackson. I am a huge fan of your curation of the album. Now, in my day, people didn't use the word curate. So when I find it applied to me, I'm always kind of tickled. And I thought about it. I thought, yeah, that's what I did. Yeah. But I didn't know it. I'm a huge fan of your curation of the album Negro Folklore from Texas State Prisons. I have it on vinyl, but my copy doesn't come with any interior liner notes or transcriptions, if there are any. This might be a long shot, but I wondered if you have any access to a transcript of this album. I've begun to piece together sentences from hours of listening, but there are still some sections that are more challenging than others. He'll tell you about this in a little while. Any help would be much appreciated. Thank you for your time, Eric Berryman. My only copy of the album didn't have any interior notes either, so I assumed there weren't any, and I responded, the album didn't have interior notes. It was before producers started to do that. I was wrong. Not only were producers doing that, but I had written the liner notes. Don't trust your memory. Make notes. I next heard from Eric on February 19th. I'm working with a theater company, the Wooster Group. And now at this time, I knew nothing of the Wooster Group. I've never worked in theater in my life. I've never had anything to do with theater, except teaching, which I guess. Anyway, I'm working with a theater company, the Wooster Group, and would like to make a theatrical interpretation of the material from this record, reinscribing it for a modern audience. He asked a lot of questions. I suggested a phone call. We arranged a time. We talked the next day. I told him about the film Afro-American Work Songs in Texas Prisons that was available on Folk Streams. Folk Streams is going to come back into this again. I next heard from him on June 7th. My director and I would love to come to Buffalo. We set the meeting for August 2nd and 3rd. Eric, Kate, and their videographer, who they referred to only as Z, came to Buffalo, and with Diane, we talked, and he videoed for 2 days. Kate asked me why I'd never responded to the 3 emails she'd sent me in January. I said, I never got any emails from you in January. The second lesson I learned from this, if you send somebody an email about something you think they're gonna really want, and they don't respond, try another means of communication.
It went to the same place my email.
The same place it went exact, yeah. We got to find that. Okay, I said earlier that the release date of the album was important. As they were leaving, as they were leaving on Sunday, I said to Kate, do you want to talk about rights? And she said, oh yeah, do you have the rights? I said, sure I do. She said, can we have them? I said, sure you can. So I had no idea who had the rights. So I went upstairs, and I'm very anal, and I found my Elektra contract from 50 years earlier. And in it, it turned out I had given Elektra the rights to the material for 50 years, which had expired 8 months before our meeting. Had it been 51 years, we would have waited. But had I signed it away forever, as the naive idiot I must have been to have given them a 50-year right, companies like that are sold, resold, and resold. To find who in the bowels of some mega corporation controlled the rights now, we'd still be doing it, and the play would not have happened. Now, every rehearsal I've attended, every performance I've attended, and there have been 15 of each now, has been different. Our conversations, the questions that came up at rehearsals, have caused me to understand and rethink things that I thought I had perfectly exhausted years ago. they're constantly tuning, tweaking, and changing things. They're absolutely wonderful to work with. And anybody can make suggestions. The lighting guy makes a suggestion, the actor makes a suggestion, I make a suggestion. They try everything. One time we were rehearsing in Liz's apartment, and Kate said, Eric, you said something in the talkback in Korea last week that I think we ought to try. Now, this is the night before the New York opening. And she reads him something from a piece of paper, which is a totally different opening for the play. Totally different. He reads it. He says, yeah, I think that might work. He did it the next day. It was totally seamless. Nobody but the 6 of us who were in the room at that moment knew it had entered the conversation the night before. And that's the way it's been with them the whole time. Now, those of you who teach know how teaching the same material can be a totally different experience depending on who's in the room. You teach something one year and it's great. Some year they're brain dead, and it's well, with theater it's like that every night, because sometimes some nights they get the gags and they cry at the right places. Sometimes they cry at the gags and they laugh at the. Wooster does something else, however, to add more to it. They have they use television a lot. Some of their plays on stage, there are 5, 6, 7 monitors, and there's one big one. But there are also 3 monitors that only the actors can see. And there's one high up, and there are 2 low at floor level. And I looked up once, and I just saw some black people just moving around. It didn't make any sense to me, so I didn't pay any attention to it. And I only learned what it was during the talk back in Buffalo. Someone asked Eric, what is on that monitor you people have in front of you? And Eric said this, it's an old film we found online, I Ain't Lying, Mississippi Folktales. It gives us something to react to, so we're not looking at the same thing every night. Well, I immediately checked out I Ain't Lying. It's on folk streams, and it's by one of my oldest friends, Bill Ferris. Here's this play based on my work, and here's Bill Ferris coming into it, and here are you coming into it. So they're bouncing, I'm pointing at Tom Davenport, who the creator of folk streams. Now, Eric's idea for the play happened when he saw the Wooster Group's play, an earlier one, Early Shaker Spirituals, a record album interpretation. And that was first performed in 2014. That play is based on the A-side of an album released by Rounder in 1979, and that was produced by Dan Patterson, another old friend and a co-founder of Folk Streams. Dan wrote the liner notes for that album. He got the recording made. He's responsible for that and another. So this play wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for Dan, if it hadn't been for Folk Streams, and it involved a lot of us. If this is starting to sound like an AFS posse made this happen, you're right, it did. I mentioned earlier that there were 8 work-in-progress performances before the regular opening. The first 4 did not have the final song. There were 14 items on this album. This album contains spirituals, work songs, spirituals, a preaching parody. It's a variety of stuff. It's not like most other prison albums, which generally consist of one kind of thing. With this, I really did want to give a sample of the range of African-American folklore that I found in that prison. After the 4th performance, Diane said to Kate and Liz, I hope you guys figure out a way to end this thing. Because at that point, it didn't end, it just stopped. Well, I'm going to play the 20-minute clip for you now. And after it's over, I'll describe the ending that they came up with, which also involves folk streams. And it was a knockout. You won't see it. And I'll tell you about 2 other folklore links in this chain.
So I was working at this Chinese tea house, and I was serving this one table. There was this woman and this man, and I heard them talking about theater, and I'm serving them tea, asking questions. They're asking me questions about tea and things, and this woman goes, "Are you a musician?" And I go, "No." And she says, "Oh, because you were talking about music, you know, and this and that." And I said, "No, I'm an actor." And she said, "Oh, okay." And I said, "Are you guys in the business?" And then this lady goes, "Oh, yeah, I'm a part of this company called the Wooster Group." And I go, "Get the fuck out of town." I just saw one of your shows for the first time. I loved it, Early Shaker Spirituals, a record album interpretation. Remember, at this point, I don't know her name. So I says, "Wait, were you in it?" Because I remember everyone that was in it. They were slightly older, white ladies. Not that they all looked alike, but you know, I didn't remember. I knew one of them because she was on, you know, TV and stuff and whatever. So I said, "Wait, were you in it?" And she says, "No, I directed it." And I said, "Kate Valk, I've been trying to contact you. I want to do the same thing with this album that I have. I have an email on my phone to you right now." And then I tell her this idea. And that's how I got here. I'm Eric Berryman, and this is going to be a record album interpretation. The record is Negro Folklore from Texas State Prisons. Work songs, blues, spirituals, preaching, and toasts. The men on this album were all convicts serving time down in the Texas Department of Corrections penal farms along the Brazos and Trinity Rivers in East Texas. The convicts in those penal farms did all kinds of hard labor. They cut down trees, chopped wood, harvested sugarcane, picked cotton, weeded fields. I'm going to play this on my turntable, listen via in-ear receiver, and attempt to transmit this material to you live as it was recorded by channeling the voices of the men on the album. Joseph Chinaman Johnson, Mac Mays, W.D. Alexander, Virgil Asbury, George White, Marshall Phillips, Johnny H. Robinson, Johnny Jackson, Eddie Ray Zachary. I found this album on Amazon, and I've had it in my personal collection for about 3 years now. Actually, this is a picture I took with my iPhone of my personal record collection in my apartment in Harlem. When I got the record, I listened to it non-stop. I felt compelled to learn these songs, really learn them. So I began to transcribe them, but I was having some difficulty understanding some of the lyrics because of the men's accents, the way it was recorded at the time on the penal farms. So I went online and Googled Bruce Jackson. He was the folklorist who spent 3 years on these penal farms, and in 1964 recorded this particular group of convicts. I found an email address for Bruce, and I wrote to him. We exchanged emails for a while, and then I went to meet him at his home in Western New York, where he is a distinguished professor at SUNY Buffalo. Bruce also collected oral histories in a book called Wake Up Dead Man, Hard Labor and Southern Blues. One of the inmates had this to say about the old days. "We didn't ride to work, we walked or ran. Slowly trot, mostly run. Have shotguns on the horses as well as pistols. You get worked to death or beat to death. That's why we sang so many of these songs. We would work together and help ourselves as well as help out our fellow man. Try to keep the officials we was working under pacified, and we'd make it possible to make a day. Be tired sometimes, be nearly too tired to eat sometimes, but we would make a day like that." It will take about an hour to do both sides of the album, and joining me are Jasper Magruder and Philip Moore. The first track on this album is a work song that would have been used for logging. Logging was the name the men gave to the job of cutting felled trees into small sections. Raise 'em up higher. Never been Houston, a boy, but I've been told women in Houston have got that good jelly roll. Raise them up a higher, higher, drop them down. Raise them up a higher, higher, drop them down. Woo! Raise them up a higher, higher, drop them down. Never know the difference when the sun goes down. Dollar Mary told old Dollar Bob. Dollar Mary told old Dollar Bob. Woo! Dollar Mary told old Dollar Bob. The dress she wanted cost $1 yard. Hush your mouth and don't you say a word. Hush your mouth and don't you say a word. Hush your mouth and don't you say a word. You shall have it if it's in this world. Raise them up a higher, higher, drop them down. Raise them up a higher, higher, drop them down. Raise them up a higher, higher, drop them down. Never know the difference when the sun goes down. Band 2, Don't Look So Downhearted, Buddy, a toast.
So don't look so downhearted, buddy, 'cause you don't receive any mail.
The women soon forget you living. They can't use you when you get locked up in jail. Now you're young and believe what they tell you about sticking through to the end. But a bender won't bolt while you done a little joke. It's just 1 out of 1,000, my friend. So now I'm old in the racket now, buddy. I've had pretty girls by the scores. They once was all I thought of, but they don't even get a tumble from me anymore. Now I did a hitch in San Quentin just to keep an old mole out of the stud. But don't you think I was sick when I found out the dick that pinched me was living with her? Now there's old Sue in St. Louis. She squalled when the judge gave me a 10. She had all the swag and said she would keep it until I was out and free again. Well, I sent her a kite by my cellmate. The boy had just finished his hitch and was free. But together they flown and left me all alone. Now I was just a sucker, you see. So I married an old bimbo in St. Paul. I bought preacher ring, license and all. We lived happy together for 6 months. Then I took another fall. She swore that she would stick. Also, she did it for 5 long years. She was waiting at the prison gate. But when I got home, boy, I had 5 kids at home. Now do you blame me for pulling my freight? Band 3, Move Along Gator. This is another logging work song. To move I made a whale, made the old gator with the notches on his tail. How they move along, gator, doggone your soul. How they move along, gator, to your muddy hole. I went to the river, I couldn't get across. I jumped on the gator, and I thought he was a horse. How they move along, gator, doggone your soul. How they move along, gator, to your muddy hole. Well, I jumped on the gator wouldn't swim. I grabbed me a club, Lord, and beat the hell out of him. How they move along, gator, doggone your soul. Now you tell your soul, how they move along, gator, to your muddy hole. I was down in the bottom, up on a log, whooping and hollering, hate me like old dog. How they move along, gator, doggone your soul. Now you tell your soul, how they move along, gator, to your muddy hole. Well, the captain and the sergeant come a-riding along. You better go to rolling, wanna make it back home. How they move along, gator, doggone your soul. Move along, gator, to your muddy hole. I got a letter from Rosie, she's sick in the bed. All of my children is a crying for bread. How they move along, gator, doggone your soul, your red-eyed soul. How they move along, gator, to your muddy hole. Band 4, Three More Brothers. This is a solo work song for work such as cotton picking and sugarcane cutting. The Moore family was well known within the units of the Texas Department of Corrections. Some of the inmates remember the days when the older Moores would have inmates paroled in their custody and would set them to work on the plantation. This is Joseph Chinaman Johnson. He sings and whistles on this track.
I was down on the Moore Brother farm. I seen a rider down on a low turn rope. I asked one of the workers, who is the fella I see riding on the low turn rope? This is what he told me. Well, who is that I see come riding, boy, down on the low turn road? Nobody but Tom Devil, that's the man they call Tom Moore. Now, I was going Down across Mr. Tom Moore's field, I was going to steal a little corn to make me some bolted meal. Now this is when the man caught me. Well, as I went walking down across Mr. Tom Moore's field, I was gonna steal a little corn, man, just to make some bolted meal. Well, I cried, please, Mr. Tom, man, please don't you murder me. Well, he laid down his pistol and he picked up a single tree. Well, Mr. Tom got land boys from the river bridge plumb up to the island farm. Well, he stand down on the levee, watch his 8th grade news move along. Now, Mr. Curry, he went to Mr. Tom. He told Mr. Tom, says, Mr. Tom says, I don't think I'm getting enough wages for my work that I'm doing. I would like for you to raise my wages. Well, this is what Mr. Tom told Mr. Curry. Well, Mr. Tom told Mr. Curry, he said, man, you ought to be satisfied. I gave you a big black woman, saddle and horse to ride. Well, the reason I like to work for the 3 more brothers so well, where they feed at their table like they do at the Rice Hotel. Well, Mr. Harry told me, boy, without a smile or grin, says you keep yourself out the graveyard, boy, I keep you out the pen. Whoa, wake up, Lucille, put on your morning gown. Babe, I don't want no loving, I just wanna feel around. Whoa, meet me down in the bottom, baby, and bring me my boots and shoes. Says I'm leaving 3 more brothers, I don't have no time to lose.
Band 5, Assassination of the President.
Oh, but it's sad. I want to tell you about a day, June, what is so sad. I don't believe you know what I'm talking about, children, when I tell you what is sad. I want to tell you about November second one is sad. Oh, and it's sad. My God. I want to tell you a long time ago, children.
What you want to say?
When they whipped them on up the hill.
Yes, they did.
They whipped the man on up the hill. And they began to nail him on the cross.
Yes, they did.
But I'm going to tell you about a day that you never will forget.
Lord have mercy.
The man was riding down the street.
Yes, he was.
He riding down the street in a long black car.
Yeah.
And a woman inside.
Lord,
And then the little children began to running and crying.
yes, they did.
And they had tears all the night.
Lord have mercy.
I had somebody cry, said, Lord, have mercy now.
Yes, they did, Jesus.
I do believe the president is gone on.
Yes, they did.
Do you believe when I said a man is gone?
Yeah.
A great man has passed away.
Yes, he has.
And a woman inside.
And one more thing I want to tell you now, son.
What is that?
I want to tell you about the woman who was on a dying bed one day. The same day that they assassinated the president, I believe it was.
Yes, it
It was
was.
a little girl, she was running around, she was hollering.
Yeah,
She asked the mother, said, Mother,
yeah,
she said, who's going to wake me up in the morning?
yeah.
She asked the mother, said, Mother, who is going to feed me in the morning? My mother looked at her and this is what she said. Lord, 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 Lord. Yes, he did.
Have the lights, please. It's really good. The set, as you can see, is kind of a simulacrum of Eric's apartment. There's that table with the tea service. On the screen behind him, we regularly see photographs of his closet, photographs out his window. Occasionally, you saw photographs of the two other singers superimposed on it. Later in the record, later in the performance, they stand up and we see them, but you don't in this one. There's one more verse to that final song, which they wouldn't sing for me. And it described the blood, that one of the guys told me about it. It described the blood on Jackie's dress. And I said, well, sing it for me. And they said, no, we can't. And I said, why? And they said, because you're from Harvard, it'll upset you too much. So I never heard the verse. Now, the way they ended it was this. As you see, for every track on it, they start playing the record. By the way, that whistling just now, that was Chinaman. That's from the record. Eric tried doing it. He just couldn't come close. I mean, that is some of the most astonishing whistling I've ever heard. So everyone, he starts the record. For the last one, Jasper and Philip leave the set. Eric starts the song, which is 44 hammers. It shares some stanzas with the first song on side one that you heard. First song, side one, was sung in traditional work song style. The last song is sung with gospel type harmony. The two guys leave, the lights dim, and we see on the screen a sequence of images. Some of the guys, some work songs, some of my photographs, some photographs from the show itself, some photographs they took in our kitchen. And then in the middle of the screen, there's a rectangle. And in the rectangle, there's a group of convicts in white suits, like the ones you saw in the photographs before, cutting up a log. So what we're doing now is we are replicating what Eric did when he described to us sitting in his room listening, except we're having an experience he could not have. That is, we're seeing them, he could only imagine them. So it ends, this thing that brings that music into the present in the theater, it takes us back and reminds us that there's a very real world, a very real physical world. There are very real people who are behind all this, who made all of this happen. When it gets to the end of the song, the whole room is totally dark. And all during the song, by the way, you've been hearing their axes strike. All during the song, you're hearing the axes. The room goes totally dark, and you hear and then silence. And everybody goes batshit. Because it makes it all real. Now, that footage that they showed in that last thing, they got from folk streams. And it is from a film that Pete, Toshi, Dan Seeger and I made in 1966. Once again, it takes a village. I mean, it wouldn't have happened without Dan Patterson's work, with the Shakers, without Bill Ferris, without Tom, without the Seegers, without me. It all fed into it. We all did our separate things. Sometimes we collaborated. But the music, the images, and all of it is brought live and brought back together again by the Wooster Group and brought into the present. And it makes me think about a lot of you in this room, the younger people in this room. What use is going to be made of your work? What things that you cannot possibly imagine or conceive is going to be done with it? How can you do it in a way that will make it as applicable as possible to as many people working in media none of us even yet can imagine? I want to read you something that happened in the last talk back, and I'll stop. If I have the page, which I don't seem to have. Oh, dear. I do. In the last talk back, somebody talked about a sheriff in Buffalo, who was generally considered a racist sheriff, and there had been a number of deaths that had occurred in the Erie County Jail, and said, what is the applicability of this to the world we're living in now? And Jasper said, that's America now. This is America now. It's not the South, it's not the past, it's our present, and it's your present. Eric said, what we've done is we've used art to bring past into the present. It's for you to use the lens of the world to understand how it will have meaning in the present. And I think that's what the Woosters did. And I think that's what we all do when we try to find things and present them to others and give them meaning and locate them. Use the lens of the world to bring the past into the present. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, many thanks again to Bruce Jackson, and I'm going to be passing this microphone around so that people can ask questions. But before that, I'm going to use my prerogative as the section convener to ask the first question, which is that at the beginning or near the beginning of the talk, you mentioned that the album has a certain structure to it that no one had noticed for 50 years, but that Eric noticed, and that sort of set him on this path. And that, of course, opens the question of how you were using the lens of the world to add some meaning or massage the meaning at least into a certain form at that time. So explain that to us, if you would.
Well, I can only explain it to you slightly. I mean, because it's really, you just got to listen to the whole thing. But and I don't mean that snidely. It's the material itself. But the way I organized it is, as I said a few minutes ago, the very first song is perhaps the most traditional performance on the album. It's sung with traditional work song. It's not even harmony. Most of it they're singing in unison. At the end, they're singing gospel. And one of the things about people in the penitentiary is they do not arrive there as a tabula rasa. They bring their culture with them. But prison is a culture. Prison is a place not just where people are, but it's a place where people live. It's like living in New Jersey, or it's like living on a battleship. It's like, it's living, so it's got its own. So what's on this album is a mixture of both. And I try to go from the most traditional to the most modern. That Kennedy song, actually, that Kennedy song was only 8 months. Kennedy had only been killed 8 months before that recording was made. So I wanted to show that normally when we do recordings of folklore in places like that, we're recording old stuff. We're looking for old stuff, looking for stuff that's been around. Well, here's something that's very new, but it's sung in spiritual gospel style, performed spiritual gospel style. But some of the lyrics are quite old. So I was trying to show the range and scope of new, old material incorporated and new old styles utilized in various ways. And bookending it with those two songs, as I said, which share some of the same verses, was the way I tried to bring it around to say, this is all of a piece, and the piece is a lot more complicated than you might think, and that's what Eric got.
Thank you. Another hand for Bruce. And now for your questions. All right, I'm going to have to run around the room with this microphone. So.
I'm really loud.
It's for the film. So.
Hi, thank you. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
I study theater, and I also study the ghostly, and I'm fascinated by this ending that you've described of the knocking, the blackout. It seems as if the past is the present is breaking at the seams, and the past is overwhelming, and like the kind of ghostly presence of these figures becomes real. Can you say more about that moment? It seems like a very haunted moment.
It was the first time Diane and I saw it. We were both just gobsmacked, as the Brits say, because the four performances the previous week ended with the seventh song on the next to last song, whatever number it was, sixth song on side B. And this is not only a song that they did, but is a total departure from everything else they did. And as I was trying to say, their performance brings that material into our present. I mean, we're not watching somebody recreating material. They're performing it in the live, vital present. Our watches show us how much time has passed. It's real, we've seen them, we can touch them. In fact, the way Wooster works, everybody goes back and has a drink if you want to, and everybody hangs around afterwards and schmoozes. That last thing, at once throws us into the past that occasioned everything we've just seen. It throws us into the creative process that Eric went through. And it puts us in all three spaces, but it also puts us in the dark alone with ourselves. Some things words aren't good enough for. And if I could have, when I slapped the table, I would have turned off all the lights in the room. But I couldn't reach the light. I should have set it up with somebody beforehand. And so what they did was they created a moment that theatrically you were in 3 time zones at once, and it was very powerful. And that's not just me saying this. I mean, as I said, we've been to 15 performances, and we've talked to a lot of people who've seen it. And that's the reaction they've had. Yeah.
Were a lot of those photographs from the ranching?
He asked if all the photographs were from the Ramsey. No, the photographs were from Ramsey, Ellis, and Cummins in Arkansas.
I was wondering, and sure many other people in this room have wondered, how do you see your work, similar or different to the Lomax's work?
I'm not going to answer that. Well, I can. I'll answer it a little bit. I won't tell you everything. My work is, I'm going to change what I was going to say. Alan took pictures too. Alan did interviews too. John didn't. And Alan was a friend. And however, prison is just part of my work. I've done a lot of other stuff too. So for me, the work I've done in prison exists in a very large continuum of things I've borne witness to over the years. And that's basically what, somebody said, what do you do? I bear witness to things. And so Alan was trying to do the same thing. However, I had more modern equipment than Alan had. Remember, I come years after, so I was able to do more. I could make longer recordings than he could for most of his career. I could record, after this first visit, I could go out in the woods and record live while they're actually cutting down trees. Alan didn't have the option to do that. So, we had, in some ways, we're prisoners, or we're guided by our hardware. What can we work with? What I have in my pocket, I was talking to Tom Rankin about this today. What I had in that 1964 visit to Texas, I filled the trunk of a Chevy 6, which is a car I bought because it had a very big trunk. And I had a lot of boxes of tapes. I had tape recorders. I had microphones. I had all kinds of crap. Now I can carry everything I need in a shoulder bag. Everything, including the clothes, because I'm wearing merino wool, which you can wear forever, So there's that. And also, I had the advantage of something Alan didn't have. I had Alan's work to look at. So I was functioning not just in looking at that tradition, but I was functioning in folklore tradition where I had that material to start out with. I could say more, but it's for somebody else.
Other questions?
Oh.
I wanted to say that recently we rescanned that old film, and that was on the initiative of Dan Patterson, because he was showing it to one of his granddaughters, and they didn't like it on a large TV because it was so fuzzy. So we worked with the Library of Congress, and it's been rescanned, and in a short while there'll be a very good copy of that Afro-American work songs in Texas prison on folk streams.
Very good.
But it's very pleasing to see how these people have taken that old stuff and reworked it.
Isn't it wonderful?
Made meaning in their lives.
Isn't it wonderful?
Yeah.
I mean, I was. It's only in the last week or so. It's because of this that I started putting all those pieces together and realized, how many of us were actually involved in making that happen. And let me give you your hard drive.
There it is, the film.
I wondered if you could say a little bit about how much this is your story and how much you're written into this communication, not written, but how much you're part of this story being told, and how much of this whole production is your story in a way.
How much of this production is my story?
The product of who you are and where you were.
Well, in general, I think what we all do is a product of who we are and what we are. I grew up in Bed-Stuy and Fort Greene in Brooklyn as a street kid. I was in the Marines, and that stuff helped me a lot working in prison because I have a really good game face. Also, I roamed the city a lot as a kid and grew up curious, and I've always been curious. And so when I worked in the prison, for example, I went to Texas to record work songs, but I wound up recording toasts, lots of toasts. I recorded hundreds of hours of interviews. I started doing photographs. I kept finding things. You know, the world just kept getting more and more complex. I was very fortunate. This is important. When I was doing this work, I was a Harvard Junior Fellow. Harvard Junior Fellow is one of the most it's like being rich. It's like being born, I'm serious, because it's 3 years in which they fund everything. They give you a salary, pay all your research expenses. There are no reports, none. You don't have to make any, you don't have to do this, nothing. All you have to do is go to 3 or 4 wine glass, 3 or 4 fork dinner on Monday nights if you're in town. That's it. It gives you time to fail. And one thing young people do not have is time to fail. If you're in the academic world, your thesis better get finished on time. Your thesis better turn into a book on time, otherwise you're not going to get tenure. I had 4 years in which a lot of the time I didn't have a clue what I was doing. I mean, every so often something would get finished, like a record would come out. But you know, what are you up to? I don't know. I'm serious. I mean, I just couldn't. I had no central guiding principle. I just did what I was interested in, and that, I think, as much as my background, enabled me to amass stuff. What I'm still drawing on it. 3 years ago, University of Texas Press published a book of my photographs from Texas and Arkansas prisons. Many of those photographs I took 64, 65, 66, in those years when I was a junior fellow. The Library of Congress. Well, recently, 2 years ago, Dust to Digital did a 2-CD album. There's a guy I met named Johnny B. Smith. He appears on one record I did years ago, an LP. 3 songs occupied a whole LP. Yeah. He sang these songs that just went on 20 minutes. And I realized they were all connected. The verses were linked, and he had the same style. It was his verse, he had a 4-line verse. There's a form called hyperbata. He'd sing a line, he'd sing a B line, he'd sing the B line again, and then he'd sing the A line. So the B line would result from the A line. Then we'd hear the B line again, and then we'd rethink the A line. It's strange. I haven't encountered it very often. Well, the guys from Dust to Digital got all the recordings I did of him, and did, what is it? Maybe it's about 2 hours long or something like that. I mean, it's an epic. I mean, it really is, and it's something I couldn't have done. But that's because I was able to just record it. It sat there for all those years. They found it in the Library of Congress, and it's still coming out. So, yeah.
Picking up on what Thomas said is, you know, the distinction between what you did and the Lomaxes before you. I mean, clearly you had a presence in the prison system. You had made friends with the wardens, and you had developed quite a rapport with the prisoners as well. And you know, you certainly had the game face. I mean, you had to establish your presence in ways perhaps sometimes unexpected, and there were situations you talked about in the past that you found yourself in that you that turned out just fine. But I mean, that's
might not have.
Right. So I mean, there were a lot of things that happened with you that the Lomaxes just simply did not experience.
Yeah.
But and I'm sure in Arkansas as well.
Yeah.
And and it was more than just the prison work songs that you. I've listened to a lot of the tapes that are housed now at the library in Texas, the reel-to-reel tapes, and it wasn't just the work songs. I mean, there was a lot of Hispanic songs and folk
Yeah.
oral narrative songs and other kinds of materials as well.
Yeah, I was omnivorous.
It's just an incredible amount of. I'm sorry.
I was omnivorous. I mean,
Oh yeah.
Yeah, well, I want to respond with two things. Diane and I was asked to be a witness in a federal case in Texas, and I said, I'll do it. This is 1978. I said, I'll do it, but I have to visit all the prisons. At that point, Texas had 12 or 13 prisons. They have 113 now. I would not, yeah. So I did, and I visited death row for the first time. I'd never gone, and I'd always turned down invitations because I felt it was voyeuristic. I had no real interest there, and I knew people there had no mobility, so I never went. But on this visit, I did, and I mentioned to my editor at The Nation, a guy named Carrie McWilliams, a really good guy, an old-time journalist. I said, death row is different from any other prison. He said, how? I said, time doesn't count. In the penitentiary, you ask anybody what you're doing. I'm doing a nickel, I'm doing a dime, I'm doing a quarter. It's the answer to what are you doing is always in time. No matter, a person might be knitting, but the answer will be in time. Death row, nobody's doing time because that's not your sentence. You're not sentenced to death row, you're sentenced to death. So it's a world of pendency. I said, somebody should make a film about it. He said, you should. I said, no. He said, oh, you should. And I thought it was because, I was such a sensitive, noble soul. He was complimenting me. And I said, why? Waiting for the compliment. He said, because you have the access. So Diane and I did. We made a film about men waiting to get executed, and we did a book about it. So, but that's the kind of thing you were talking about. Now, all of this happened. I got very lucky. When I was at Harvard, I knew I wanted to do work songs. I wanted to record them somewhere. And there were 3 states that had them, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas. I had relatives in Texas that I hadn't seen for a long time. I wrote the commissioner in Texas. And he said, come on down. And he had a PhD in classics. He was a Lutheran minister, had been president of 2 small Lutheran colleges, one in Texas and one in Illinois, as I recall. And he'd been on the prison board. The director of the prison, a guy named O.B. Ellis, had died, and they asked George Beto to come back and be the commissioner. And George and I became great friends because he liked, in Huntsville, Texas, George didn't have a lot of people to talk about certain things of interest to him about. So we used to talk a lot. We'd sit around, we'd drink, and we'd talk. And he even invited me to join this poker club, the Longfellow Literary Society of Huntsville, Texas. So George gave me carte blanche. He picked up the warden. I remember the first time I met him in Huntsville. He picked up the warden. The warden of Ramsey was a guy named Sidney Lanier, grandson of the poet. Grandson of the poet, who was the first teacher of American literature at Johns Hopkins University. Wow. And he says, warden, I'm sending somebody down there. He may have strange requests. Give him whatever he wants. Hung up the phone. Nobody, and then it was like that. And that's the reason I got into Arkansas, because when these guys went over from Arkansas, I knew Arkansas was, a bad place. I wanted to see what the worst prison in the U.S. looked like, which was the first one declared unconstitutional. I thought I'd do an article for Harper's or the New York Times Magazine. And they couldn't not give me carte blanche because they knew I'd tell everybody in Texas that they'd gone chicken. So they did. So, and that's how I got all. So it was really lucky that a lot of it is luck. So much of our work is about access. It's about, finding the way in, finding somebody who'll let you in, finding some. When Diane and I did a second book about capital punishment about 5 years ago. The University of North Carolina published it. We tried to revisit Texas. They wouldn't return our emails. They wouldn't take our telephone calls. They wouldn't let us visit. When the Texas photo book came out 3 years ago, I tried to revisit Arkansas. Same thing. Couldn't get it. Nothing. And people down there, there's still people around who know me, and they said, he's not going to lie. Nothing. I mean, those places. No way in the world I could do that work now. Yeah. So.
Hi. I wanted first of all to thank you. Your modest you say it's luck, but also I think we all owe you a lot of thanks for being the right person in the right place to be able to share this and to share it with Eric. And my question is really, if you can talk more about him and about what you understood in your relationship with him. He's so profoundly moved and so profoundly he's connecting with this. I'm sure that he has very thoughtful reflections on it, and if you can share that, that'd be
yes, I
interesting.
can. Eric grew up in a musical family. His father ran a jazz joint in Baltimore, and so he was around music all his life. He was, when he contacted me, the same age I was when I did this work, which is a resonance we have both commented on many times. He and our children get along very well, and so my son said, I always wanted another brother. So, occasionally he writes, he says, "Dear Dad," and so we got this great relationship. He has taken this on himself. What he did, the last time I saw him, he told me, he had gone to Ancestry.com, something like that. He had looked up every one of these guys, every one of the guys on the album. He's looked up all of their prison records. He found out who got out. He found out who died, when they died. He's found out things about them. I once told him about a book by an Australian named Shane White, who wrote a book saying in the 19th century, the only place you got accurate descriptions in the mid-19th century of black people was in ads for runaway slaves. Because everything else was a caricature. They got big lips, they got but in your ad for a runaway slave, you don't want to be a caricature. You want to get your slave back. So you really describe what you're, and so he went through these prison records. He said, it's just like that. They say he's 5'8" inches tall. He's got a scar on his left knee. And so he got really involved in it in a lot of ways. And as you can see how he got involved in the music. I don't know if you could, I think you could tell from the 4 items you heard, he does different voices for each of them. It's a magnificent performance. It's really astonishing. And by the way, everything he does, every cough, there are a couple times he coughs. That's not him coughing, that's the guy on the record coughing. So they do the record exactly. The one thing they're faithful to is the record itself. They don't change anything else. I mentioned before that things are changing all the time, and they are, but not that. They don't. About one thing that changed the last time I saw it, when they did it in Buffalo, was there's far more. It used to be they just played the original recording at the beginning, then they faded it out totally. Now they have it faintly through the entire thing. So it's far enough away so it's not like a duet, but there's the ghost of it there. And it's sort of keeping those two time zones going. So they're always doing so. So we're doing another one. We're doing another play. We're doing one based on my Toast book. With Eric and Kate, they're working on it now. But that'll be totally different. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. Bruce, thank you again for everything you've done, and especially for contributing to the Library of Congress's Symposium of the Poor People's Campaign. And I learned very quickly, I think, not to email you. I called you, I think, more than I've ever called anybody else in my entire life. And with great conversations, I learned a lot. And watching this production and then having had occasion to watch Pete and Toshi Seeger and Dan's film, Afro-American Work Songs from a Texas Prison, I'm wondering if you were to go back into, if you were to go into Angola, for instance, if they let you have access to it, it doesn't strike me that you'd be getting a whole lot of work songs. What you would get is maybe prisoners working on a corporate model of working for call centers, being leased out for either in a business or whatever else. And is that something that you've had occasion to consider as you've gone through this, been reliving the last 50 years of your work?
Well, you're mostly right, except I got an email from Dan Patterson yesterday, who told me about somebody who wrote folk streams, who saw this on folk streams, who said she or he had been in, I think the woman was in the women's prison at Gatesville in 2002, and they were working in the fields, and they were made to work by somebody calling cadence. Somebody calling cadence. You had a good home, but you left, you right. You had a, like as in the military, except it's not them doing it now. It's one of the guards doing it. But they were working in unison. Now, that's not typical, but some things go on. What happened here was the reason we made that film in 1966, Pete said, I suggested it, and if you go to the folk streams, there's statements by Pete and me, in which Pete says, Bruce suggested this to me, and I say, Pete suggested this to me, and I'm right, because he's not here. And what he said was, they're integrating those prisons now. As soon as they're fully integrating those songs, those songs will be gone forever, because the white guys won't be able to do them. And the convicts had said that to me many times. I'd heard that. Those white guys can't do it. They don't have a sense of rhythm. So, it's what happened. There were two things that contributed to the end of it. One was integration. The other was younger prisoners associated with with slavery time. Because it does come from slavery time. Some of the songs, if you look at 19th century lyrics, some of those verses appear. As I said before, some of those farms where I recorded there had been black guys singing those songs, doing that work in exactly those spaces 100 years earlier. So there was that associated with it. But, yeah. Well, for a long time, they didn't get machinery in Texas. They picked cotton by hand. When you see those photographs earlier, there was no need for them to pick cotton by hand. They could have done those fields in 2 days with a cotton machine, which they wouldn't have to buy, you just rent it, which is what the big cotton farmers do. But they had all those bodies. So they just used the bodies.
We'll take one more question, so you're going to be our final question.
It's not so much a question as a comment on the last thing you said. It sort of recapitulates the arguments among historians of technology that obviously a cotton picker would be harder to make than a McCormick reaper. But what made it even harder was, as long as you had enough bodies, why should you invest in that? And so it recapitulates that larger history. It's just odd.
Well, no,
not odd, it's worse than odd.
No, somebody could write a very good book about they're called books about slavery. It's the economics of bodies, of using bodies. And at what point do you decide you don't need the bodies anymore?
All right, we're gonna let Anna ask a question.
Well, I just wanted to thank you for beautiful work you've done. And also, I wanted to just tell you all that I once took some of Alan's recordings. A friend of mine, an African-American social worker, worked with newly released prisoners in New York. And I wanted to see what they would say about these songs. And I took the recordings there, and we met in a circle in the room, and I explained that I didn't say very much. I just explained that they were recorded some time ago in the South, and I would appreciate getting their feedback. And these men were mostly black. There were like 3 or 4 Hispanics and a couple of white guys. And they started crying.
Wow.
And they said, this is our essential music. They said, this is, I don't remember the phrases they used, but they said, this is our, like, Bible or something. It's better than gospel. This is who we are.
Oh, wow, thank you.
Said
You're going to make me cry.
They did. And they said, we do this in our work in upstate, but we use like pop songs and I mean, soul music or whatever they were using, but they identified it with that.
Well, let me.
It was incredible. I recorded the interview and I.
That's wonderful. But let me say something more about Eric, because you reminded me of something important. He was telling me why he responded to this album the way he did. He said, I know a lot about music. I grew up in music. I had never heard this stuff before. He said, and I realized this is who I am. Thank you.
So perhaps I should have said it at the perhaps I should have said it at the beginning. One of the most accomplished and distinguished folklorists of our time, Bruce Jackson.
Thank you.